Apologies for the gap in communications. It's just been a particularly busy couple of weeks, mostly sorting garlic and repairing the house. And Sandra was away on her horse, so I had a few more jobs every day. But I have managed to do some things, and I'll tell you about them because you might find them interesting, including some work on Tornado, the air locomotive. But more on that in another video. This one is about the wooden car project. Ready? Okay. Last time I'd worked out that I needed to move the suspension from the front end to the back end. So I built a simpler front end that's all fixed and solid and interlocking. I even treated myself to a new lump of 9x2 lumber. Actually, it's because the last one was just a bit too short. Unfortunately, a 3-wheeler has to be longer than a 4-wheeler because that back wheel has to go behind the driver instead of next to him or her. Apart from being neater and simpler, this front end construction meant I could move the pedal crank forward by a couple of inches. Partly because I'd moved the steering cables to the front of the axles out of the way. Having them forward of the axles means the wires don't have to cross over each other, but you need 2 little pulleys instead of 1. And the linkage rod between the 2 wheels no longer needs a hinge in the middle, so that's all simpler too. I'd like to bring the crank even further forward, but that would mean a much more radical rebuild, and I'd only gain maybe a couple of inches, 2 or 3 inches at most. Bringing the crank forward means the driver moves forward too along with the centre of gravity, which is a good thing. And it shortens the whole vehicle too, which decreases the turning circle and the amount of materials used. So I was happy enough with the front end, all nice and rigid then, and I took the opportunity to raise the crank too. It was a little low before and heels could touch the ground, but that affects the steering position. As you know, I'm trying to find a position that's not too horizontal and not too upright, yet still means the car can corner safely. But the equation is complicated. For instance, as you lower the seat, you need to lean back more, otherwise you'd bend more in the middle, and leaning back more means a longer chassis, and the longer the car, the harder it is to keep it all rigid, and of course the bigger turning circle. But if you make it too short, then you're forced into a more upright driving position, and that means a higher center of gravity, and that means less stability, and it also means that the whole car is taller and more prone to being blown around on a windy day. So of course it's all a compromise, trying to find something that works when there are so many variables. So I was happy with the crank, but I felt that the seat was just too high now. Now I could have lowered it by cutting out some of the central spine, but I decided to lower the whole spine instead by 16 centimeters, which is quite a lot really. And that meant taking everything apart again. And cutting a new joint for the front end. That was all good for the seat height, but now of course the crank wouldn't go under the spine because it was too low, and it couldn't go over it either because it would be too high, so I had to cut a slot out instead. Remember, all this is just a prototype, so don't worry that parts are very rough. I'm still trying to get the relative positions of the key components, so everything got moved around a few times. Of course, in the final version, I could replace that spine with a sandwich of plywood with all the appropriate holes cut out on the CNC machine. which would make it all much neater and easier. But this spruce spine isn't really very heavy, and it is easy to work on. Will calls it a tree trunk because he thinks I should be making a monocoque body, but it's not as simple as that. A monocoque body means the strength is in the outside shell of the car, like a crab in his shell, whereas a conventional car chassis has its strength inside, like a skeleton in a human. Theoretically, a monocoque design could be stronger and lighter and more rigid, but it depends what you're trying to build. For instance, a modern electric car might have a motor in each wheel, so there's no mechanical transmission through the car and hence no torsion. But my car has a crank and a chain that runs down the middle of it, and someone pedaling furiously, which means pressures in all sorts of directions. And that means the central line has to be held particularly rigid somehow. So my plan is to use a combination of shell and skeleton to achieve this. So the bodywork will be essential, but I'll keep some sort of spine too. I was trying to think of an example from the animal kingdom for this, but I couldn't think of anything much. A tortoise maybe? A shell but also a skeleton? Anyway, this is a floor pan, or a partial floor pan anyway, and it's part of the outer shell. There could be a floor right under everything, but then you'd need a reverse gear. With a big hole in the floor, you can just use your feet instead. Just don't get your heels stuck under the part of the floor that is there. That's why it can't come very far forwards. This floor pan will have beading in the corners where it joins with the sides. Those beadings need to be curved, so I cut through them partially. And this is the main bulkhead, the one that goes just behind the seat. A combination of bulkheads and webbing and floor pan and seating pan and sides and bonnet and boot will, I hope, end up providing the stiffness that's needed. The back wheel is held in a frame that is hinged to the bulkhead, but I need to accommodate the chain too, so there's a hole in that bulkhead, but I didn't make it quite low enough. Yes, if I'd drawn this out in 3D, perhaps I would have seen that, but there's nothing like real life to show you the obvious. With a chain as long as this one will be, I think we'll need at least one extra free wheel keeping the chain in place. So maybe it's not so important exactly how big the hole is, but I did hack out a couple more inches for now. And then I drilled some holes out of threaded bar. Because I'd noticed that the springs that I had tried for the front suspension would actually screw very firmly onto that 20mm thread, which is quite handy. So I made up a simple frame where both ends of the springs could pivot and tried that out for the back suspension. I'd put in some temporary braces for this test, but there won't be room for them really because the seat has to be able to come right back up to that bulkhead. And all the weight of the driver is pushing the wheel up and the wheel is pushing forwards, in effect trying to push that bulkhead over. So how can I support it? I could put a narrow brace up from the spine on one side, but not on the other side because that's where the chain runs. So I took everything apart again. Just so I could cut a slot in the end of the spine. You can see why progress has been slow. It's partly because we're getting nearer to the end layout, and that means there are more pieces in position and each adjustment is getting smaller, but they affect more things. Anyway, after reassembling everything, I had a strong joint and still room for the seat, which is a good thing. That bulkhead still flexes though at the edges, but that should be solved when the side walls go on. But then after that, I decided that the double springs were just too soft anyway, and I'd need maybe 6 tennis balls if I used those. So instead I just mended a bicycle suspension spring and tried that. Now, I didn't notice at the time, but you can clearly see a problem with this setup. The chain length changes as the bike goes up and down. And I found out soon afterwards that it works the other way around too. As I pedalled, the car was lifted up and then it flopped down when I stopped, which of course is a big waste of energy. And that happened because that back wheel frame was hinged too high up. Just lowering that hinge a couple of inches made all the difference. But it also pushed the wheel back another inch. So it's all connected and it's all intricate and a bit complicated. But it is fascinating to see all the interactions as they manifest themselves. I put the sides back on, and this time I was able to attach them to the floor pan as well as the front and the seat bulkheads, which all helps with stiffness. People keep saying I should be making this with steel or aluminium, but those have their drawbacks too. And if we could design a wooden car, then anyone with a jigsaw should be able to make one. So here we are, and you might be thinking, well now Tim, that looks much the same as it did in the last video. But actually I'm quite excited now because everything has been jostled into a new position, and I think that the seat is finally in the right place and at the right height, and the crank is as far forwards as possible, and the spine is the shortest it can be, and the back suspension works, though it is a bit creaky because it's old and worn out. The steering wheel is a bit of a challenge. I think it's in the best position it can be, just behind the knees. Any further back and you couldn't get in, and further forwards and you'd have to stretch slightly to reach it, and if it's higher up then your arms would get tired. So I think all the key components are now in the right places. So in a way, all I have to do is stiffen up the whole shell, and then we can do some proper road tests with it. The body shell has to fit around the components obviously, but I think I can still make it look pretty good with a nice long bonnet and some sort of cutaways to make it easier to get in and out. It's going to need a roof of some sort, but I'm hoping that could be folded away. Of course, if there was a roof frame permanently bridging over the driver, then the whole car would be more rigid, but it wouldn't look like a little sports car, would it? No. So I'll only do that if I really need to. It's all still quite light, though we are up to 45 kilograms, I think. And you can get at everything easily enough. And some great news just in. Bum bum bum. I have been sponsored by a very nice company with a brand new hub motor and wheel. So this thing just might go somewhere. Thanks for bearing with me on this slightly long and boring episode, but I thought you might get a better understanding of the challenges if I went through things as I came upon them. Designing something from scratch is quite tedious really, and you never know for sure if it's going to work at all until you get to the end. But I have high hopes now for this one. Right then, more garlic to process while I'm thinking of the next step. Take care.